Today on Sports Central, we'll be going over our XFL Week 2 power rankings for this season, and also we'll be going over analysis on each of these teams as they went through Week 1 and also look forward to Week 2. Starting off with number 8 is going to be the Tampa Bay Vipers, and this team we knew would be a bit of a wild card this upcoming season. Of course, Aaron Murray, their quarterback, was a bit of a toss-up, but nonetheless, he kind of disappointed in this week as expected. Of course, it's been a little while since Aaron Murray played. He's 16 for 34, 231 yards, and 2 interceptions, so it was a pretty tough day for him. Their top running back was Smith, who had 16 attempts for 79 yards and no touchdowns. And their wide receiver is Williams, who is the biggest standout on this team last week. 6 receptions, 123 yards, and no touchdown to go along with that. Nonetheless, they lose this week to the Guardians on the road, 3-23, which the Guardians really aren't, or they didn't really look like all that great of a team. So to lose by 20 to them is a bit concerning. But nonetheless, next week they have to travel to Seattle to play the Dragons, and then their home opener is going to be on the 22nd against the Houston Roughnecks, which that should be a pretty tough game. But nonetheless, they do really need to beat the Dragons if they're going to have a chance of having a really good season, in my opinion. Of course, when you don't know anything about any of these teams, really everything is a toss-up for every team. Number 7 is going to be the Los Angeles Wildcats, and this team lost to the Roughnecks 17-37. And the only reason why I'm keeping the Wildcats at 7 and not putting them at 8, of course they had the worst loss of the day, is just because their quarterback, Josh Johnson, their quarterback that was expected to start, was not playing in Week 1. They had Knauf instead, which he didn't really have all that bad of a day. He was pretty inaccurate though, which is probably the biggest concern for me. 21 for 40, 214 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. Their top running back was Hood, who had 12 attempts for 43 yards and no touchdowns, and their wide receiver was Spruce, who is probably the MVP of the day for the Wildcats, 11 receptions for 103 yards and no touchdowns. Nonetheless, looking ahead for the Wildcats, they lose the Roughnecks this week, 17-37. They get the Renegades next week, which should be an interesting one. Of course, the Renegades took a loss this week, and many expected them to be the top team of this entire season, so it could be a tough game there. But then they have the Defenders again at home the next week on the 23rd, so that should be an interesting game there as well. Number 6 is going to be the Seattle Dragons, and this team lost to the Defenders on the road 19-31, but really they kept with the Defenders for mostly the entire game. That was a really good game, probably one of the better ones of the week. Nonetheless, they're now 0-1, and their quarterback Brandon Silvers did not have all that great of a time. He was 21 for 40, 217 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. So he did have 3 touchdowns, which is a high number, but he had 2 interceptions to go along with that, and also he was just about 50% on completion. The running back Farrow had 7 attempts for 41 yards and no touchdowns, but nonetheless, Austin Proehl he had 5 receptions for 88 yards and 2 touchdowns, so he's probably the MVP of the day for the Dragons. He didn't have all that bad of a day. I think he's got a ton of potential. Of course, he had 2 touchdowns, and he probably honestly could very well have been the best wide receiver that we saw this entire week out of the XFL. Looking ahead for the Dragons, so they lose this week. Next week they got the Vipers at home, which they need to win that game, and then the Renegades the week after that. Number 5 is going to be the Renegades, which was the team coming into the season that was my favorite to end up going on to winning the championship, but they lost to the BattleHawks this week, which is a bit concerning, which I thought the BattleHawks honestly were probably one of the worst teams going into this game as well of the XFL. So this is a bit of a concerning loss. But nonetheless, I'm still leaving the door wide open for the Renegades. I think that they've got a lot of potential to still go on and have a really good season. But nonetheless, their quarterback, Landry Jones, he was expected to start this season. He was not playing in this game, and so they had to use their second quarterback, Nelson, which he didn't have all that bad of a day. They used him heavily, 33 for 42, 209 yards, and 1 interception was his performance. So it wasn't all that bad for 33 and 42, but he didn't put up any touchdowns and had an interception, so that is a bit concerning if they're going to go ahead with him. Their top running back was Dunbar, who had 5 attempts for 27 yards, no touchdowns. Wide receiver was Nagel, who had 6 receptions for 43 yards. So they used a lot of wide receivers in this game if their top wide receiver only had 43 yards. Looking ahead for the Renegades, though, they lose to BattleHawks this week. They got the Wildcats next week in Los Angeles, and then the Dragons the week after that. So really the outlook for the Renegades is quite easy. They should win these next couple of games, I think. But if they do lose these games, it's a bit concerning for the Renegades going and looking forward to the playoff. Number 4 is going to be the BattleHawks, and we're going to now start off with the 1-0 teams. This team beat the Renegades 15-9 last week. Quarterback Tamu was 20 for 27, 209 yards and 1 touchdown, so he had a really good day actually. And then the running back was Jones, who had 21 attempts for 85 yards and no touchdowns. And then the wide receiver was Namorne Pearsonell, who had 4 receptions for 64 yards and no touchdowns along with that. So overall, a really good day for the BattleHawks. I thought they won a very tough game. Of course, going into this game, the Renegades were certainly looking as the favorite to win the championship. So this was a really good win, especially on the road for the BattleHawks. So yeah, good for them. It was a bit of an ugly win, though. There were a couple of concerns, of course. But nonetheless, Jordan Ta'amu, he had a really good day. He's got a lot of potential looking forward to the rest of the season. Looking ahead for the BattleHawks, they beat the Renegades this week 15-9. And then the next week they got the Roughnecks, a really tough game, of course, on the road. And then it's the Guardians after that. So really, the BattleHawks are going to be entering the season with a big, really tough schedule. Of course, the Roughnecks and the Guardians both won this week, in which we have the Guardians next at number 3. They beat the Vipers this week 23-3, and their current record is 1-0. Quarterback Matt McGloin was 15 for 29, 182 yards, 1 touchdown. So really, he didn't put up all that impressive of a performance. Nonetheless, the top running back was Victor, who had 9 attempts for 32 yards. Then the top wide receiver was McKay, who had 3 receptions for 58 yards and touchdowns as well. So nonetheless, they got a really good win against the Vipers. Of course, the Vipers, though, don't look like they're going to be the winner of the championship this season. But nonetheless, it's still a win. It's still a win by 20, and they also were able to keep the Vipers at 3. And if you watched this game, the New York team absolutely shredded this Tampa Bay offense, no doubt about that. So that's going to be really good for them heading forward if their defense indeed does look as good as it was. Number 2 is going to be the Defenders of Washington, D.C. Of course, they beat the Dragons last week at home, 31-19. Their current record is now 1-0. Their quarterback, Cardale Jones, of course, we all know him as the Ohio State quarterback that somehow, someway won a national championship. He had a decent day, 16 for 26, 235 yards, and 2 touchdowns. I think he's probably going to end up being quite possibly, the best quarterback of this entire league this season. Top running back was Presley, who had 12 attempts for 31 yards and no touchdowns. And their wide receiver was Rogers, who had 6 receptions for 73 yards. So nonetheless, it was a really good day for the Defenders. Of course, they win this game by 12. Next week, they got the Guardians, which should be a really interesting game. Of course, both teams won last week. Then they get the Wildcats after that on the road in Los Angeles. So nonetheless, should be a really good schedule for the Defenders. Of course, you're not starting out all that tough, but you do have a couple of tough games here and there. Number 1 is going to be the Houston Roughnecks. They beat the Wildcats 37-17, and I could not resist but put them at number 1. Of course, they had a lot of really good performances on this team. Of course, their quarterback Walker, 20 for 39, 272 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 1 interception. Their top running back was Butler, who had 9 attempts for 30 yards and 1 touchdown. Wide receiver was Phillips, 4 receptions for 67 yards and 1 touchdown. So really, this team really rounded around their quarterback Walker's really good performance. Of course, putting up 4 touchdowns. He was the best quarterback of the day, putting up some really good stats, and that's going to be good for the Roughnecks looking forward. Looking forward, though, in the schedule, they beat the Wildcats this week by 20. Next week, they got the St. Louis BattleHawks, and then the Vipers on the road on the 22nd. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not the Roughnecks can keep this up. But honestly, looking at their performance this week, it wouldn't surprise me to see a single bit the Roughnecks going on to the playoffs. This was a really impressive performance. And I also know we're still very early on, but nonetheless, it should be interesting to see how the Roughnecks go doing forward. Nonetheless, let me know your thoughts in the comments below on each one of these teams. We're going to be doing some more XFL analysis over the week. We'll be going over our game predictions for week 2, so stay tuned for that. Thank you guys all for watching, though, once again. Stay tuned for more from All Sports Central, and I will see you all later.